Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are cracking open a figure so foundational, so enormous, that his shadow stretches across, what, 3 major global religions?
At least, and deep into the architecture of modern law and politics.
We are diving deep into Moses, the man, the prophet, the lawgiver, the ultimate revolutionary.
This is a spectacular deep dive because Moses isn't just a religious figure. He's really the lens through which much of the world views concepts like moral law, governance, and the very meaning of liberation.
Right.
So our mission today is to take all the sources we're talking, biblical narrative, skeptical historical criticism, even notes from the U.S. founding fathers,
Wow.
and just pull out the essential insights about his towering influence.
And the fascinating thing is, the mystery starts before he even says a word. Even his name is locked in this debate between 2 totally different cultures.
Hebrew and Egyptian.
Exactly. So that's our immediate hook. Okay, let's unpack the core story, and then we can zero in on that name mystery.
Let's do it. Let's start with the familiar arc. The story, which you'll find primarily across Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. It introduces him as the son of Levite parents, Amram and Jochebed.
And he's born in Egypt under that chilling decree that all newborn Hebrew boys have to be killed.
Exactly. So his mother places him in a basket, an ark of bulrushes on the Nile.
Which is, of course, where Pharaoh's daughter finds him. She adopts him, raises him in the opulence of the royal court. He grows up Egyptian, but the sources are pretty clear. He still feels a connection to his heritage.
Oh, absolutely. And that internal conflict it explodes when he sees an Egyptian taskmaster beating a Hebrew slave.
He snaps.
He does. He kills the Egyptian, which forces him to flee into the wilderness of Midian. He settles there, marries a woman named Zipporah.
And his life as a shepherd is then interrupted by, one of the most famous moments in all of religious history.
The burning bush. The angel of the Lord appears to him on Mount Horeb. And it's here that God reveals the divine name YHWH and commissions Moses to go back to Egypt to deliver his people.
And that just sets everything in motion. The 10 plagues, the dramatic Exodus, the parting of the Red Sea.
But the moment that really cements his global status is the covenant at Mount Sinai.
The 10 Commandments.
That's the one. He's traditionally seen as the author of the entire Torah, which makes him the supreme lawgiver of Israel. Not just the Decalogue, but all these other bodies of law, like the covenant code and everything that follows.
So he spends 40 years leading the Israelites through the wilderness, and the story ends with him dying at, the age of 120?
A very impressive 120, yes. On Mount Nebo, having seen but not actually entered the Promised Land. It's a complete narrative of service and sacrifice.
Okay, let's circle back to that name, Musa, or Moses, because this is where you find a really wonderful little nugget about destiny.
It is. The biblical folk etymology, the one most people know, it links the name to the Semitic root.
Meaning to draw out.
Right. Pharaoh's daughter names him that because she drew him out of the water.
Simple enough.
Yes, the common understanding is passive. He was drawn out. But what's so fascinating is how Jewish commentary flips this. An 11th century commentary points out that the name actually implies the active participle.
Wait, what does that mean?
It means draw out.
So the princess wasn't naming him the one who was drawn out, but the one who will draw out.
Precisely. If you accept that reading, the name given by his Egyptian benefactor immediately prophesies his true destiny.
That he will draw others out of Egypt.
The name isn't just a record of his rescue, it's a mission statement from day one.
That's fantastic. It makes the name itself a form of prophecy. But then there's the other theory.
The Egyptian one. And this theory is, just as compelling.
Okay.
The Egyptian root memzi, or mos, just means child of. It's a super common part of Egyptian names, usually is an abbreviation.
Like Thutmose or Ramos.
Exactly. Thutmose is Thoth is born, Ramos is Ra is born. If you just drop the divine name, you're left with Mus.
So if that theory is correct, his name just means child, which would reflect his status as an adopted royal.
It's a debate between a Semitic name reflecting his mission and an Egyptian name reflecting his identity and upbringing.
And what's the kicker?
The kicker is that ancient Jewish writers themselves, people like Philo and Josephus, they actually recognized the Egyptian character of the name. So this tension, this duality, it launches us straight into the territory of history versus legend.
And this is the historical hot zone. This is where everyone always wants to know, did he actually exist, or is he a purely legendary figure?
And we have to be direct here. The majority of scholars today view the biblical Moses as, largely a legendary figure.
There's room for a real person in there somewhere.
There is. There's room for the idea that a Moses-like figure may have existed, maybe in the mid to late 13th century BCE, but the events, as they're described, they lack confirmation.
And the challenge is always the lack of external evidence, which is just startling when you think about the sheer scale of the story.
It's the critical barrier. We have no contemporary Egyptian records, zero,
Yeah.
that mention a Moses or the 10 plagues or this massive migration of people. Nothing. No archaeological evidence confirms the events in the Sinai from that period either. The evidence for the story, as written, is just missing from the material record.
The narrative structure itself even feels a bit like a literary construction, using these well-worn tropes from the ancient world.
Exactly right. The story of Moses' discovery, the infant in a basket on the river, it's not unique at all.
Right.
It follows a common ancient Near Eastern motif. The origin story of Sargon of Akkad, who lived centuries earlier, is almost identical. His mother puts him in a rush basket and sets him adrift. It points to a shared literary tradition for establishing a great leader's destiny.
Okay, so if we assume there was some kind of historical catalyst, a real person that inspired this story, what are the most provocative alternative identities that scholars have proposed?
Well, the theories often try to connect him to real Egyptian political upheaval. There's one that links him to the Pharaoh Amenmos around 1200 BCE, suggesting the name was simplified. But I think the most intriguing theory involves a figure named Irsu.
Irsu. Okay, tell us about him, because that name sounds like it could hit close to the Exodus narrative.
Irsu was a Shasu, a nomad from Asia, who actually managed to seize power in Egypt toward the end of the 19th dynasty. He took control, he disrupted Egyptian rituals, and he ruled for a bit with Asiatic support before he was eventually driven out.
So how does that parallel the Exodus?
The parallels in the flight. When Irsu and his followers were expelled, the sources claim they abandoned huge quantities of gold and silver that they had apparently taken from the temples.
Ah, and the Israelites are said to have taken gold and silver with them when they left.
Exactly. It could be a historical distortion or an echo of that event. It shows how a political expulsion could be, reframed into a grand narrative of divine liberation.
And it seems like this story, a leader named Moses leading people out of Egypt, was pretty common in the Hellenistic world, even among non-Jewish writers.
Absolutely. Greek literature had all these alternative and sometimes pretty hostile accounts. The Egyptian priest Manetho, whose work is preserved by Josephus, he recorded a tradition about Osarseph, a renegade priest who leads a band of lepers, renames himself Moses, and is driven out.
So the story was widely known, even if it had a negative spin.
Right. But then you also have positive accounts, like from Hecataeus. He described Moses as a courageous leader and a lawgiver, and even compared his legal framework favorably to famous Greek legislators. So by that period, Moses was firmly established as the quintessential lawgiver, no matter his historical status.
That idea of the quintessential lawgiver brings us to his staggering influence across the Abrahamic faiths. Let's start with Judaism, where he holds, the highest possible station.
In Judaism, he is Moshe Rabbeinu, our leader Moses. He's seen as the greatest prophet who ever lived, the one who received the entire law, both written and oral, directly from God.
But there's a key distinction made.
A critical one. Judaism is very, very careful to maintain that Moses was a human being. He is not to be worshipped. That's a huge difference from many other religious founders.
And I love the little cultural detail that comes from his death at age 120.
It's one of the most heartwarming takeaways. Because the book of Deuteronomy explicitly records his death at 120. That became the source for the common Jewish blessing. May you live to 120. It's a simple human wish that grounds this colossal figure.
Moving to Christianity, Moses is a constant presence. He's mentioned more in the New Testament than any other Old Testament figure.
For sure. He's primarily the great symbol of God's law.
And his function is often what you'd call typological.
Exactly. So for you listening, typology is this method of interpretation where a person or event in the Old Testament is seen as prefiguring something in the New Testament.
And Moses' life is constantly used that way to anticipate Jesus.
Constantly. A clear example is when Jesus compares Moses lifting the bronze serpent in the wilderness for healing to his own crucifixion, saying the Son of Man must be lifted up.
But the most potent moment is probably the Transfiguration.
Oh, visually, absolutely.
Yeah.
Moses and Elijah appear alongside Jesus, representing the law, that's Moses and the prophets, that's Elijah validating Christ's identity.
And then we shift to Islam, where Moses, or Musa, takes on this enormous central role.
Musa is the most frequently mentioned individual in the entire Quran. His life story is told more extensively than Muhammad's, in his career confronting oppression, receiving revelation, it closely parallels and foreshadows Muhammad's own prophethood.
He's both a prophet and a messenger.
A Nabi and a Rasul, yes.
Yeah.
Carrying major scriptures. And you get these key narrative variations in the Quran, too.
Right. Like, who finds him in the Nile?
Yes. In the Islamic account, it's Pharaoh's wife, Azia, who discovers him. She's a devout woman who convinces Pharaoh to keep him, and she becomes a major figure of faith herself.
And there's another incredibly influential tradition.
You're talking about the 5 daily prayers.
Exactly.
Right. So according to a key hadith, Muhammad meets Moses in heaven during his night journey. Initially, God commands 50 daily prayers.
50.
50. And Moses wisely advises Muhammad to go back and ask God to reduce the burden on his followers, which eventually results in the 5 daily prayers we have today. So Moses' wisdom directly shaped the foundation of daily Muslim practice.
That is an incredible connective thread, and he's also important in the Baha'i faith and the Druze faith.
Right. This connectivity just confirms that the figure of Moses is more than a biography. He's a universal archetype for the leader who establishes a covenant. That's a concept that really transcends denominational walls.
Speaking of archetypes, let's pivot to his very concrete legacy in secular law and politics, especially in the United States.
Yes, this is where the idea of the lawgiver becomes so tangible.
And it's embedded right from the start.
From the very start. The Pilgrims saw themselves as the new Israel. John Carver, the first governor of Plymouth Colony, was literally called the Moses of the Pilgrims. They saw their journey as a modern exodus.
And the Founding Fathers grabbed onto this imagery, especially during that critical time right after independence.
That's the key.
Yeah.
They were in a chaotic post-revolutionary period. John Adams, who was highly educated, he specifically said he relied more on Moses' laws than on Greek philosophy for the Constitution. He believed Moses did more to civilize the world than all the Greek legislators combined.
And Benjamin Franklin even suggested they just govern temporarily by the laws of Moses until a new code could be worked out.
He did. He justified it by saying the code was delivered personally by the Supreme Being. They were desperately seeking a unifying moral authority. And of course, George Washington was often called America's Moses after he died.
The archetype of the deliverer was just as powerful in the civil rights movement?
Incredibly so. The Exodus narrative was the perfect, visceral framework for understanding oppression and liberation. Harriet Tubman was famously nicknamed Moses. Black Americans called Abraham Lincoln their Moses after the end of slavery. And Martin Luther King Jr. repeatedly used that journey from bondage in Egypt to the Promised Land as the entire blueprint for the civil rights struggle.
Before we move on, we have to talk about the most famous visual detail, which is actually a mistake.
The horns.
The horns.
It is probably the most celebrated artistic error in history. When you look at Michelangelo's statue of Moses in Rome, he has horns. And this comes entirely from a mistranslation.
In Jerome's Latin Vulgate, how did that slip-up happen?
So the Hebrew word is Karen. When Moses comes down Mount Sinai, the original text says his face Karen, which means reflected radiance or shone. But Karen can also mean horn.
Oh, no.
Jerome, translating into Latin, chose the horn reading cornuta, and that just became the standard depiction in Western art for 1,000 years. The intent was brilliance, the result was bovine.
A language error immortalized in marble. And it's interesting, his symbolic presence in American law continues.
He's still there. He's one of the 23 lawgivers depicted in the U.S. House of Representatives chamber. And critically, while all the other figures are in profile, Moses is the only one depicted forward-facing,
Directly addressing the room.
reinforcing his unique status as the ultimate foundational lawgiver.
Okay, we have to move to the final, necessary layer of this deep dive. The criticism. The moral conflicts that arise when you read the texts attributed to him literally.
This is a challenging but essential part of understanding the sources. You have someone like the Enlightenment deist Thomas Paine, for example, who took direct aim at Moses. He called him a detestable villain.
That's harsh. What passages fueled that critique?
Paine was focused mainly on the commands given after the war with the Midianites in the book of Numbers, chapter 31.
Right.
The passage details the victory and then the instruction to execute the male children and the non-virgin women of Midian while keeping the virgin girls for the Israelites. It's a passage that, through a modern lens, sparks extreme moral revulsion.
So how do the theological traditions handle a text like that?
This forces that necessary neutrality check to understand the context the sources themselves provide. The counter-arguments generally fall into 2 camps: divine command and symbolic meaning.
Okay, let's start with the symbolic argument.
Many rabbinic commentators saw this not as simple genocide, but as a symbolic and drastic condemnation of those who had deliberately led the Israelites into sin and idolatry just before the war.
So it's a spiritual cleansing.
That's the framing, a necessary act to save the community from a threat to the entire covenant. The second defense is simpler, that the war was commanded by God as an act of revenge. In that theological framework, Moses is just an intermediary, carrying out a severe divine judgment.
We have to acknowledge that tension.
The tension between the literal description of violence and the theological justifications in the sources themselves, it's unavoidable.
We have journeyed through an incredible spectrum today, from a cradle in the Nile to revelation at a burning bush to the founding of law, the inspiration for civil rights, and the target of deep moral criticism.
We really have. And whether you conclude that Moses was historical, a legendary construct, or some combination, he remains the quintessential lawgiver and deliverer. His story provides the blueprint for liberation across centuries, defining what it means to lead a community out of chaos.
We saw early on that the name Moses, meaning drawer out, was interpreted prophetically. He drew his people from Egypt. But considering the scholarly debate about his origins, if the story of Moses is primarily a vehicle for conveying law and identity, what enduring human truths does the act of drawing out a community from chaos reveal about the nature of selfless leadership itself? That is something for you to mull over until our next deep dive.